What keeps a human alive when survival stops being the point? I learned the answer in the Flesh Pit, where orcs don't just kill you. They rebuild you. They test how much a body can endure before it stops being human, how long consciousness persists when pain becomes the only constant, and whether entertainment value can outlast structural integrity. The Imperium teaches that death in service to the Emperor grants meaning. The orcs taught me something different. That meaning itself is a luxury, and in the pit, only one thing matters: whether your suffering amuses them more than your death would. My name was Guardsman Varro Kelth of the Mordian Iron Guard, 88th Regiment, 3rd Company. Those designations meant something once. Now they're just sounds my mind repeats to remind itself that I existed before the pit, that the person recounting this was once part of something structured and comprehensible. The orcs took that away first, before they took anything physical. They dismantled the architecture of identity with the same methodical brutality they applied to everything else. We were deployed to Varsavia Prime, an industrial world on the edge of the Sheridan sector. The PDF had reported orc raiders hitting outlying manufactorums, standard harassment that usually meant a small warband testing defenses. Command designated it a pacification operation, expected duration 3 weeks. We would sweep the industrial zones, eliminate the greenskin presence, restore Imperial authority. The Codex Tactica contained 17 approved tactical formations for such operations. We implemented Formation 7, considered optimal for urban industrial environments with minimal civilian presence. The orcs had been on Varsavia for 8 months. Intelligence failures of that magnitude don't happen by accident, but we learned that only after the first wave of our deployment was surrounded and overwhelmed in the northern manufacturing district. I was part of the second wave, sent to reinforce positions that no longer existed. We landed directly into an ambush that suggested the orcs had not just studied Imperial tactics, but anticipated them with disturbing precision. My last memory before the pit was the explosion that tore through our Chimera transport. The vehicle's armor held against the initial blast, but the secondary charge, planted with unexpected sophistication beneath a structural weak point, split the troop compartment open. I remember the sensation of flight, brief and disorienting, before impact drove consciousness away. I woke to the smell. Nothing in Imperial training prepares you for the olfactory assault of orc habitation. It's not merely unpleasant. It's a physical presence, a thickness in the air that coats the throat and sinuses. Organic decay, chemical waste, burning promethium, and something else. Something fundamental to orc biology that human senses can't properly categorize. The smell alone told me I was no longer in any structure built by human hands. The pit occupied what had once been a promethium refinery. The orcs had repurposed it with their characteristic disregard for original function, tearing out processing equipment to create a circular arena approximately 80 meters in diameter. The walls rose 15 meters to a platform where orcs gathered to observe whatever transpired below. Emergency lighting, still partially functional from the facility's human operation, cast irregular pools of illumination across the space. The orcs had added their own lighting, crude but effective, focused on the pit's center. I was not alone. 17 other humans occupied the space, all in various states of injury and consciousness. Some wore Imperial Guard uniforms from different regiments. Others wore the remains of PDF gear or civilian clothing. One man was naked, except for crude bandaging wrapped around his torso. All bore the marks of orc handling, bruises and lacerations consistent with being grabbed by massive hands and thrown with casual violence. The floor beneath us was not the original refinery surface. The orcs had layered it with packed earth and what appeared to be organic material, creating terrain that shifted underfoot with disturbing texture. Later I would understand this choice served multiple purposes, all related to the pit's function. "Stay down," the man nearest to me whispered, his voice carrying the accent of a hive world. "Movement draws attention before the selections begin." I complied, remaining prone despite every instinct demanding I assess my situation, identify exits, formulate tactical options. Those instincts belonged to Guardsman Kelth. In the pit, they were worse than useless. The orcs above us were not watching. Not yet. They moved about the platform in their characteristic manner, shoving each other, gesturing with crude tools and weapons, engaged in what might have been conversation but sounded like controlled violence. Occasionally one would lean over the edge to spit or throw refuse into the pit. Once, a large stone landed 3 meters from my position, heavy enough to crack bone if it had struck someone. "How long have you been here?" I asked the man who had warned me. "Don't know. Days, maybe a week. Time stops working, right?" His name was Sorek. He had been part of the Varsavia PDF, stationed at a water reclamation facility when the orcs overran it. That had been his estimate, 4 months ago. He thought. The orcs had kept him in various holding areas before transferring him to the pit, 3 days prior, though he couldn't be certain of that time frame either. "What is this place?" I asked, though the question was inadequate to encompass what I sensed, but couldn't yet articulate. "Entertainment," Sorek replied. His face, visible in the uneven light, showed no emotion. The flatness of his tone suggested not acceptance, but the exhaustion that follows prolonged horror. "They get bored. We fix that problem." Before I could pursue the implication, a change occurred in the orc behavior above. The random movement coalesced into attention directed downward. The noise level increased dramatically, guttural vocalizations that might have been excitement or anticipation. Shadows moved across the platform's edge as more orcs arrived, drawn by some signal I hadn't perceived. A massive orc descended into the pit using a chain ladder that groaned under its weight. The creature stood perhaps 2.5 meters tall, its musculature grotesque even by greenskin standards. Crude armor plating, welded and bolted directly to flesh in some places, covered portions of its torso and limbs. It carried a weapon that appeared to be a combination of several Imperial firearms, melted together and reinforced with scrap metal. The weapon's functionality was dubious, but the orc's physical presence made armament almost secondary. The orc surveyed the humans in the pit with the posture of someone evaluating livestock. Its small eyes, buried in scar tissue and crude cybernetic modifications, moved methodically from one prisoner to another. When those eyes fixed on me, I experienced something worse than fear. Recognition. The orc saw me not as an enemy or a threat, but as a resource to be allocated. It pointed at 3 prisoners, making sharp gestures that the other humans apparently understood. Those selected stood slowly, their movements suggesting they knew resistance would be counterproductive. The orc grabbed the nearest one, a woman in torn PDF fatigues, and examined her arm with what might have been clinical interest if performed by something possessing medical knowledge. It bent her arm at the elbow, testing the joint's range of motion, then released her and gestured toward the pit's far end. The 3 selected prisoners moved in the indicated direction. I watched their faces, searching for some indication of what awaited them, whether this selection represented death or something else. What I saw instead was resignation complicated by something unexpected. Relief. These prisoners were relieved to have been chosen. The Ork departed, ascending the chain ladder with surprising speed despite its bulk. The platform's noise intensified further. More Orks were arriving, their attention focused on the far end of the pit, where the selected prisoners now stood. The lighting in that section brightened, additional crude lamps activated by unseen mechanisms. "What happens to them?" I asked Sorek. "Depends," he replied. "Sometimes they fight. Sometimes they build things. Sometimes the Orks just want to see how long bodies last under specific conditions." The selected prisoners were indeed fighting, though not each other. A section of the pit's wall had opened, revealing a chamber beyond. From that chamber emerged creatures I initially mistook for some variant of Ork, until their movement patterns registered as wrong. These were Gretchen, the smaller greenskins that served Ork society in various capacities. But these Gretchen had been modified, augmented with crude mechanical limbs and weapons integrated directly into their bodies. The modifications appeared recent, flesh still raw around the insertion points. The three prisoners engaged these modified Gretchen with improvised weapons pulled from the pit's floor, lengths of pipe, fragments of metal, pieces of equipment I couldn't identify. The combat was neither skilled nor heroic. It was desperate and ugly, bodies colliding with maximum force and minimum technique. The Gretchen possessed numerical advantage and mechanical augmentation. The prisoners possessed size, and perhaps the certainty that defeat meant something worse than death. The Orks above responded to this spectacle with enthusiasm that vibrated through the structure. Their vocalizations reached volumes that physically hurt, a wall of sound that made thought difficult. They threw objects into the pit, some landing near the combat zone, others falling randomly among the non-selected prisoners. One Ork produced a crude musical instrument, something between a horn and a pipe organ, and blasted discordant notes that seemed to energize the fighters below. The combat lasted perhaps 4 minutes. One prisoner fell when a Gretchen's augmented claw opened her throat. The spray of blood provoked intensified reactions from the Ork audience. The remaining 2 prisoners fought with increased desperation, managing to destroy 2 Gretchen before the third drove a blade-modified limb through one prisoner's torso. The last prisoner standing grabbed the embedded blade and, in a move born of either courage or madness, pulled herself closer to the Gretchen while using a metal fragment to batter its skull until both collapsed. The Ork's response was deafening. Some seemed pleased, making gestures that resembled approval. Others appeared disappointed, throwing more objects into the pit. Several began fighting among themselves, their disagreement over the entertainment's quality escalating to violence that mirrored the combat they had just witnessed. 2 Orks descended to retrieve the bodies. They moved with efficiency that suggested routine, gathering the fallen prisoners and Gretchen without ceremony or apparent concern for which might still be alive. All were dragged toward a different section of the pit's wall, where another opening led to darkness beyond. The bodies disappeared into that darkness, and the opening sealed behind them. "That's the selection," Sorek said quietly. "Sometimes you fight, sometimes other things. But always, the Orks watch. That's the point. We're not prisoners. We're programming." The next selection came 6 hours later, though I had no reliable way to measure time. The emergency lighting cycled irregularly, and the Ork presence on the platform varied without discernible pattern. My body's biological rhythms, trained by years of military discipline, tried to maintain regularity, but found no external reference points to calibrate against. This time, the descending orc was different, smaller than the first, but draped in what appeared to be trophies. Human skulls, Imperial Guard insignia, lengths of flak armor, still marked with unit designations. The creature carried tools rather than weapons, a collection of crude implements hung from a belt that might have once belonged to a Mechanicus adept. It selected 5 prisoners, including Sorek. The chosen 5 were directed not toward the combat zone, but to a different section where equipment had been dumped. Machinery components, partially disassembled vehicles, piles of scrap metal and wire. The orc gestured at this material, then at a crude schematic painted on the pit's wall. The schematic depicted something mechanical, though its function wasn't immediately apparent. "Build it," the orc said. Its voice was deeper than expected, the Gothic words heavily accented but comprehensible. The 5 prisoners examined the schematic and available materials. I watched their faces cycle through confusion, recognition, and resignation. Whatever the schematic depicted, it was possible to build from the provided components. The question was whether successful construction would improve their situation or merely lead to a different form of exploitation. They built it anyway. What else was there to do? The process took hours. The orcs above watched with sustained attention that suggested genuine interest rather than mere sadism. They called out occasionally, sounds that might have been encouragement or criticism. When the prisoners encountered difficulties, some orcs threw additional materials into the pit. Once, when a structural element collapsed, killing one of the 5 prisoners, the orcs' response was not anger, but what seemed like analytical interest. They observed how the remaining 4 adapted to the loss, how they modified their approach to account for reduced labor. The finished product resembled a weapon, something between a cannon and a flamethrower, built on a wheeled platform that could be pushed by human strength. The orcs descended to inspect it, their examination thorough. They tested moving parts, checked structural integrity, and ultimately wheeled it toward the same darkness where the combat casualties had been taken. The 4 surviving builders were not killed. Instead, they were marked, crude paint applied to their foreheads in what might have been symbols or simple identification. Then they were released back into the general pit population, their selection concluded. "Entertainment through labor," Sorek explained when he returned. He moved slowly, favoring his left side where falling machinery had caught him. "They like watching us build things, especially things that work. It's all about the watching." I began to understand the pit's true nature. This was not a prison or a holding area. It was a theater, and we were performers in a show with no final act, only endless variations on themes of suffering and survival. The orcs had created a sustainable system where the entertainment value of prisoners exceeded the satisfaction of simply killing them. The resources allocated to this operation suggested its importance within the orc hierarchy. The pit occupied valuable space in captured territory. It required maintenance, guards, and a steady supply of prisoners. The orcs could have simply executed captured humans or enslaved them for labor. Instead, they invested in infrastructure designed purely for observation and amusement. My 3rd day in the pit, I watched an orc force 2 prisoners to race across the arena's floor. The floor had been modified, sections removed to create gaps filled with what appeared to be caustic fluid. The prisoners had to navigate this obstacle course while orcs threw objects at them from above. One prisoner fell into the fluid and died screaming. The other reached the designated endpoint and was given food, real food, not the nutrient paste we had been receiving. The Ork audience reacted to both the death and the survival with equal enthusiasm. My fourth day, I watched an Ork lower a cage containing a wounded Imperial Guard officer into the pit. The officer had been deliberately injured, multiple lacerations that bled, but weren't immediately fatal. The Orks threw medical supplies into the pit, crude bandages and antiseptic solutions, then watched to see if other prisoners would attempt to save him. Several did. The Orks observed their technique, their coordination, the emotional dynamics between strangers working toward a common goal. When the officer was stabilized, the Orks retrieved him, examined the medical work, then threw him back into the pit from a height that shattered both his legs. My fifth day, I was selected. The Ork who descended was scarred extensively, its face barely recognizable as such beneath layers of tissue damage and crude reconstructive surgery. It carried a container filled with what I initially thought was water, but recognized as something more viscous. The Ork pointed at me and three others, then gestured toward the pit's center. We moved as directed. The other three prisoners were veterans of multiple selections, their bodies marked by the crude paint symbols that denoted survival of previous entertainments. They moved with the efficiency of people who had learned to minimize wasted motion, conserve energy for the moments when maximum effort would be required. The Ork poured the container's contents onto the pit's floor, creating a circular area perhaps 5 meters in diameter. The substance spread across the packed earth, seeping into the soil with a hissing sound that suggested chemical properties incompatible with organic material. The smell intensified, sharp and acrid, overwhelming of the pit's baseline reek. "Drink it," the Ork commanded. The three experienced prisoners complied immediately, dropping to their knees and placing their faces near the contaminated soil. They didn't actually drink, I realized, but they mimicked the action convincingly. The Ork watched them, its expression unreadable, then turned its attention to me. I hesitated. The hesitation was instinctive, self-preservation asserting itself despite understanding that resistance would be counterproductive. The Ork's posture shifted, shoulders dropping slightly, head tilting. It was, I realized, curious. Curious whether I would comply. Curious what form my resistance might take. Curious how far it would need to push before I broke. I lowered myself to the ground and placed my face near the contaminated area. The fumes alone caused immediate respiratory distress, throat constricting, eyes watering. I opened my mouth and let the liquid touch my lips. The burning sensation was instantaneous and spread rapidly. I pulled back, my body's autonomic systems overriding conscious decision-making. The Ork made a sound that might have been laughter. It reached down and grabbed my head with one massive hand. The grip was irresistible, fingers wrapping around my skull with pressure that caused immediate pain, and the certainty that minimal additional force would crack bone. The Ork pushed my face into the contaminated soil. I couldn't breathe. The liquid filled my mouth, my throat, burning tissue as it went. I tried to resist, to pull away, but the Ork's strength was absolute. My vision darkened at the edges, consciousness dimming under the combined assault of suffocation and chemical trauma. The Ork held me there for what felt like minutes, but was probably only seconds, then released me. I collapsed onto uncontaminated soil, coughing violently, my body attempting to expel the liquid I had been forced to ingest. Blood came up with the coughs, bright red against the pit's dirt. The pain in my throat and chest was unlike anything I had experienced, intense enough that coherent thought became difficult. The Orks above were pleased. Their vocalizations reached new volumes, and several threw objects into the pit, in what might have been gestures of approval. The orc who had forced me to drink the liquid stood over me, watching my body's reactions with sustained attention. It made notes on a crude data slate, marking something with a stylus gripped awkwardly in its massive fingers. I survived the chemical ingestion. My body's enhanced conditioning, the result of Imperial Guard augmentation procedures, provided margins of survival that unaugmented humans might not have possessed. But survival came at a cost. The tissue damage to my throat and digestive system took days to manifest fully, during which eating became excruciating and breathing required conscious effort. The orc who had conducted this selection returned 3 times during my recovery period. Each time, it examined me closely, checking my throat visually, pressing on my abdomen to assess internal damage, taking notes on its data slate. It was, I slowly understood, conducting research. The pit wasn't merely entertainment. It was also a laboratory where orcs tested the limits of human physiology through practical application. This realization reframed everything I had witnessed. The combat selections tested stress responses and injury tolerance. The construction selections tested cognitive function under duress. The chemical ingestion tested metabolic capacity and survival thresholds. The orcs were systematically documenting what humans could endure, not for strategic purposes, but because they found the information interesting. Sorek explained it more directly during one of the periods when the orcs' attention was focused elsewhere. "They're curious about us," he said, his voice hoarse from his own previous selection. "Not the way we're curious about machines or enemies. They're curious the way children are curious about insects. They want to see what happens when they pull the wings off." The comparison was apt. The orcs' intelligence was considerable, far beyond the brutish stereotype Imperial propaganda promoted. But their intelligence operated according to values completely alien to human psychology. They understood cause and effect, could plan and execute complex operations, possessed technological capabilities that rivaled or exceeded Imperial equivalents. But they applied that intelligence toward ends that made no sense within human moral or practical frameworks. The pit represented a significant investment of resources and attention. Maintaining it required infrastructure, guards, continuous prisoner supply, and the time commitment of orcs, who could have been deployed for combat or other productive activities. Yet the orcs maintained it enthusiastically, suggesting that whatever value they extracted from observing human suffering exceeded the operational costs. My 6th week in the pit, a new prisoner arrived. She was different from previous arrivals, her physical condition far worse. Massive trauma to her left leg, partially amputated below the knee. Burn scarring across 60% of her torso. Multiple fractures visible through torn clothing. She should have been dead. Instead, she was conscious and impossibly mobile. The orcs carried her into the pit with unusual care, almost tenderness. They placed her in the center of the arena and stepped back, their attention focused entirely on her. The platform above filled with orcs, more than I had ever seen gathered for a single event. Their usual cacophony of sound diminished to near silence, replaced by an anticipatory tension that pervaded the space. The woman stood. The action should have been impossible given her injuries, but she stood, her ruined leg supporting weight through mechanisms I couldn't identify. She moved forward, each step accompanied by sounds of grinding bone and tearing tissue. She walked in a complete circle around the pit's perimeter, her gaze fixed on the orcs above. Then she spoke. The words were not Gothic, not any human language I recognized. They came from her throat, with inhuman resonance, syllables that hurt to hear. The orcs responded immediately, their silence breaking into organized vocalization that might have been song or chant. They were responding to her, engaging in some form of exchange I couldn't comprehend. This continued for perhaps 20 minutes. The woman collapsed afterward, her body finally acknowledging the damage it had sustained. The orcs descended in greater numbers than usual, perhaps 8 of them, and carried her away with the same careful handling they had shown when bringing her in. They did not take her to the darkness where other bodies went. Instead, they carried her toward a different exit, one I had never seen used. "What was that?" I asked Sorik. "Wrong question," he replied. "Right question is, what was she becoming?" The answer came 3 days later when the woman returned. Her injuries had been treated, not healed, but stabilized through methods that combined imperial medical technique with something else. Crude cybernetics replaced her missing leg. The burn scarring had been covered with grafted skin that didn't quite match her original flesh tone. But the most significant change was in her eyes. They retained human structure, but held something inhuman, an awareness that looked out through biology it no longer entirely belonged to. She moved through the pit with authority that the orcs acknowledged. She examined prisoners, sometimes touching them as the selecting orcs did, evaluating their condition and capacity. She spoke to several in that same inhuman language, and some responded, their voices taking on that same painful resonance. I understood then what the pit truly was. Not merely a source of entertainment or research data, it was a conversion facility. The orcs were searching for something in their human prisoners, some quality or potential that emerged under specific conditions of stress and trauma. When they found it, they cultivated it, transforming those individuals into something that served purposes I couldn't begin to articulate. The woman approached me during her 3rd inspection tour. She stood close enough that I could smell the antiseptic used in her treatment, mixed with something organic and wrong. Her eyes moved across my face, reading information from features and expressions. "You understand," she said. The Gothic words were clear despite the inhuman undertone. "That makes you valuable." "Understand what?" I asked. "That survival is not the point, that there is no escape, that the only choice is between transformation and dissolution." She touched my chest, her finger resting directly over my heart. "Your heart still beats with human rhythm. That will change." She moved on to inspect other prisoners. The orcs watched her work with the same attention they brought to all pit activities. When she finished her inspection, she spoke to the orcs in their language, gesturing towards specific prisoners. Those prisoners were marked with a different symbol than usual, a spiral pattern that covered most of their foreheads. That night, the marked prisoners were taken, not to the darkness where bodies went, but to the same exit the woman had used. They walked willingly, their expressions suggesting not fear, but something closer to anticipation. Whatever waited beyond that exit was understood to be preferable to remaining in the pit. I was not marked, but I had been noticed, evaluated, and found to possess whatever quality the orcs sought. The knowledge sat in my mind like a weight, pressing down on thoughts and identity. I had survived 6 weeks in the pit by accepting that survival was contingent and meaningless. Now I understood that survival itself was part of the process, that staying alive was not victory, but merely continuation of an experiment, whose conclusion would be my transformation into something other than human. The selections continued. Combat, construction, endurance tests, chemical exposure, psychological stress experiments. Each selection revealed new aspects of what the orcs found interesting about human physiology and psychology. Each survivor carried markers of their experience, physical and mental alterations that accumulated over time. Some prisoners broke. Their minds, unable to process the sustained horror, simply stopped functioning coherently. The orcs' response to these broken individuals was neither cruel nor merciful. They were removed from the active pit population and placed in a separated section where they sat in catatonic silence until death claimed them. The orcs observed this process with the same interest they brought to everything else, documenting how long consciousness could persist after the organizing principle of personality had dissolved. Some prisoners adapted. They learned the patterns of selection, developed strategies for survival, formed alliances with other veterans. These adapted prisoners lived longest, their continued existence proof of human resilience and the orcs' success in creating sustainable entertainment. But adaptation came with costs, personality eroding under the pressure of necessary compromises, identity becoming provisional and negotiable. I existed somewhere between these extremes. I had not broken, my mind still capable of analysis and self-awareness. But I had not truly adapted, had not accepted the pit as normal or inevitable. I maintained the fiction that I remained Guardsman Vero Kelth, that my identity was stable despite everything that had been done to maintain it. The fiction was becoming harder to sustain. My 10th week in the pit, during a construction selection, I built a weapon. Orcs had provided materials and a schematic, just as they had for previous construction projects. But this schematic depicted something functional, a projectile launcher capable of inflicting serious damage. I built it with care, making sure each component was properly integrated, that the weapon would actually work when activated. The orcs tested it by having me fire at a target they designated. The target was another prisoner, one who had been marked for transformation. I sighted down the weapon's crude barrel, my finger on the firing mechanism, and recognized that I had reached a decision point. I could refuse, accept whatever consequences that brought. I could fire and miss, demonstrating defiance through sabotage. Or I could fire accurately and accept that I had become an active participant in the system that confined me. I fired accurately. The projectile struck the designated prisoner in the torso, the impact sufficient to cause immediate incapacitation. Medical orcs descended to retrieve the wounded prisoner, their efficiency suggesting this was expected and routine. The orcs above responded with their usual enthusiasm. I was marked with the survival symbol and given extra rations. That night, I tried to understand what I had become. Guardsman Kelth would have refused, accepting death rather than collaboration. The person I was now had calculated that cooperation offered better odds of continued existence. That existence itself retained value, even when stripped of dignity or purpose. The transformation the woman had warned about was occurring, but not through external modification. It was happening internally, my values and identity restructuring themselves around the simple imperative to continue. Sorek found me during the dark period, when the orc's attention was elsewhere. He sat beside me without speaking, his presence a reminder that I was not alone in this evolution. Whatever we were becoming it together. "How long have you been here?" I asked him, not for the first time. "Doesn't matter," he replied. Also not for the first time. Time is something that happens to people who aren't in the pit. We're somewhere else. He was right. The pit existed outside normal temporal flow. Days meant nothing when each selection could be your last, when sleep came irregularly and consciousness remained optional. The only meaningful measure was selections survived, marks accumulated, transformations undergone. What happens when we're completely transformed? I asked. We stop being entertainment, Sorek said. We become something else. Maybe guards, maybe parts of other projects. The orcs always have projects. The prospect should have been horrifying. It was merely factual. The pit was a processing facility, converting raw human material into forms useful for orc purposes. Some prisoners became combat subjects, testing grounds for weapons and tactics. Some became construction workers, building with their enhanced understanding of human-scale engineering. Some became medical subjects, contributing data about human physiology under extreme conditions. And some became whatever the marked prisoners were transforming into, serving purposes I still couldn't fully grasp. My 11th week, the woman returned. She moved through the pit with increased authority, her transformed nature now obvious to anyone with eyes to see. Her skin had taken on a greenish undertone. Her musculature had increased beyond human norms. Her eyes reflected light within human color. She was, I slowly realized, becoming orc. Not fully, not yet, but the process was undeniable. She approached me directly this time, without the pretense of general inspection. She studied my face for a long moment, then nodded as if confirming something. "You're ready," she said. "For what?" "Selection for transformation. You've survived enough. You've adapted enough. You've demonstrated qualities the orcs value. Tomorrow, you'll be marked." The information should have provoked resistance or fear. Instead, I felt only exhausted acceptance. I had known this moment was approaching. The pit's logic was inexorable. Survival led to adaptation. Adaptation led to transformation. Transformation led to purposes beyond the pit's entertainment function. "What will I become?" I asked. "Useful," she replied. "That's all that matters here. The Imperium wanted you to die for the Emperor. The orcs want you to live for them. In the end, the only difference is duration." She left me there, marked for the next day's selection. I sat in the darkness and tried to remember why I had valued my humanity so highly. What had it granted me except the capacity to suffer coherently? The orcs offered transformation that would reduce suffering, replace it with purpose, integrate me into a system where my role was clear and expectations manageable. The reasoning was seductive because it was partially correct. Human identity was a prison of its own kind, constraining possibility within narrow parameters of acceptability. The Imperium demanded absolute conformity to standards that had nothing to do with individual capacity or desire. The orcs demanded only that you be useful, and they would modify you as necessary to enhance that utility. But there was a cost beyond the physical. The woman who had been human and was becoming orc had lost something essential, some organizing principle that made her experiences her own rather than merely data points in orc experimentation. She moved through the pit with authority, but not autonomy. Power, but not freedom. She had traded one form of servitude for another, and the new form was arguably more absolute because it operated at the level of biology itself. I did not want to become that, but I had no means to prevent it. The next morning, if morning meant anything in the pit's irregular lighting, the orcs came for me. 4 of them, including the one who had forced me to ingest chemicals. They moved with purpose, their attention focused entirely on me. Other prisoners backed away, creating space, acknowledging that this selection was different from the routine entertainments. They did not drag me or force compliance. They simply indicated I should follow, and I did. We left the pit through the exit used for marked prisoners, entering corridors that still bore traces of the refinery's original purpose. The Orks had modified these spaces extensively, but the underlying human architecture remained visible, a reminder that this facility had once served comprehensible functions. We descended through multiple levels, passing other Orks engaged in various activities. Some were working on mechanical projects, assembling weapons or vehicles from salvaged materials. Some were handling prisoners who appeared to be in various stages of transformation, their bodies bearing modifications ranging from subtle to grotesque. Some were simply existing, gathered in groups and engaged in activities I couldn't interpret. The Orks brought me to a chamber that resembled a medical facility, if medical facilities were designed by beings with only theoretical understanding of sterility and patient comfort. Equipment of obvious imperial origin had been integrated with Ork technology, creating hybrid systems that were simultaneously sophisticated and crude. Several prisoners were already present, strapped to tables while Orks worked on their bodies with tools that seemed equally capable of precision surgery or brutal disassembly. One of my escort Orks gestured toward an empty table. I understood the instruction and complied, lying down on the surface that was still warm from previous occupancy. Restraints closed around my limbs automatically, the mechanism responsive to weight distribution. I could move slightly, but not enough to interfere with whatever procedures were planned. The Ork who had documented my chemical exposure approached with its data slate. It reviewed information displayed on the screen, making occasional notations, then held the slate where I could see it. The screen showed a detailed medical scan of my body, highlighting areas of interest with color coding I didn't understand. My throat showed extensive scarring from the chemical damage. My musculature showed patterns consistent with sustained stress. My neurological structures showed alterations I couldn't identify. "Good specimen," the Ork said. The Gothic words were clear, suggesting this Ork had more practice with human language than most. "Strong recovery. Good adaptation. Useful baseline." "Baseline for what?" I asked. The Ork made a sound that might have been approval of the question. "Integration. You survived because something worse died in your place. Now you become something else so that future survivals continue. Cycle continues. Entertainment continues. Understanding increases." It was the most comprehensive explanation any Ork had offered about the pit's purpose. The system was self-sustaining, converting prisoners into transformed servants who could then help process new prisoners. The entertainment value came not just from observing suffering, but from documenting the transformation process, tracking how human biology responded to various stressors and modifications. "I don't want to be transformed," I said. The statement was futile, but necessary. Some part of me needed to voice resistance, even knowing it would be ignored. "Want is irrelevant," the Ork replied. "Function matters. You have demonstrated function. Now function will be enhanced." Other Orks entered the chamber carrying equipment. I recognized some items from Imperial medical facilities. Others were clearly Ork-made, their design principles incomprehensible, but their intimidating presence unmistakable. The lead Ork selected several tools and began arranging them in what might have been preparation order. "Wait," I said. "What will happen to me?" The Ork paused, considering the question. "Physical modification, neurological adjustment, chemical treatment, integration of enhanced capacities. You remain you, but improved. Better survival characteristics, better stress tolerance, better utility. Will I still be human?" The Ork tilted its head, the gesture suggesting genuine puzzlement. "Human is category. Category is flexible. You will be useful category. That is superior to useless human. The logic was impeccable from the Ork's perspective. Utility superseded identity. Function determined value. The transformation would enhance my survival capabilities while making me more useful to Ork purposes. From an objective standpoint, the trade might even be favorable compared to my current existence. But something in me rejected the reasoning, not because it was wrong, but because accepting it would mean accepting that the Imperium's propagandists had been correct about at least one thing: that humanity's value was tied to its essence, not its capabilities. That transformation into something more physically capable, but fundamentally different, was still loss, even if the entity that survived couldn't recognize what had been sacrificed. "I refuse," I said. The Ork's response was not anger, but curiosity. "Refuse means what? Pain? Already have pain. Death? Already close to death. Transformation improves situation. Refusal achieves nothing." "It maintains identity," I replied. "It preserves the thing that makes me me. Identity is memory pattern plus response characteristic," the Ork said. "Both will be preserved. Enhanced, but preserved." "You refuse enhancement?" The philosophical debate was surreal, strapped to a table, while an Ork wielding surgical implements argued for the superiority of pragmatism over essentialism. But the debate mattered because it represented the final choice available to me. I could accept transformation and potentially survive with diminished but functional consciousness. Or I could resist and force the Orks to either kill me or break me completely. The woman appeared at the chamber's entrance. She moved with the confident stride of someone who belonged in this space, who had earned authority through transformation. She approached my table and looked down at me with eyes that reflected too much light. "He's refusing," the lead Ork explained to her. "I know," she replied. "I refused too. Then I understood." "Understood what?" I asked. "That the transformation is mercy. The pit breaks everyone eventually. You can break and become nothing, or you can transform and become something. I chose something. You're choosing nothing disguised as principle." "I'm choosing to remain human." "You stopped being human the first time you fired that weapon at a marked prisoner," she said. Her voice carried no judgment, just statement of fact. "You stopped being human every time you survived a selection by accepting Ork logic. Every time you prioritized continuation over resistance. The body you're trying to preserve is already compromised. I'm just making that compromise explicit." Her words carried weight because they were true. I had been transforming all along, making incremental choices that accumulated into fundamental change. The person I was now would be unrecognizable to Guardsman Kelth. Rejecting physical transformation wouldn't restore what had already been lost. "The difference," I said slowly, working through the argument even as I spoke, "is that those changes were mine, made under duress, made in response to impossible circumstances, but still mine. What you're offering is to replace my agency with enhancement, my choices with programming." "You think you have agency in the pit?" she asked. "You think your choices are yours when Orks control every aspect of your environment, when survival itself is contingent on their entertainment? Agency is the first thing the pit takes. I'm offering you the second thing: purpose. Purpose in service to Orks. Purpose," she repeated, "which is more than the pit offers, more than the Imperium offered. At least the Orks are honest about what they want from you." The argument was sophisticated, more sophisticated than I would have expected from someone undergoing transformation into Ork biology. But that sophistication was precisely the point. She retained intelligence, and philosophical capacity, even as her body changed. The transformation wasn't lobotomy or replacement, but integration. She was right that it might be mercy compared to alternatives, but it was still surrender. "Begin procedures," the lead orc said, apparently tired of philosophical debate. It moved toward my table with tools selected and ready. The woman placed her hand on the orc's arm, stopping it. The gesture was presumptuous, a transformed prisoner interfering with orc decisions, but the orc paused, acknowledging her authority through transformation. "Let me show him first," she said. "Let him see what transformed prisoners actually experience. Then he can choose with knowledge instead of fear." The orc considered, then nodded. Brief demonstration. Then procedures continue regardless. The woman moved to stand beside my head. She placed her hands on either side of my face, her grip firm, but not painful. Her skin felt wrong, texture and temperature off in ways I couldn't specify. She looked directly into my eyes, and I saw something move behind her pupils, something that responded to my attention by pressing forward against the biological constraints of her optic nerves. "This will feel invasive," she said, "but it won't damage you. I'm going to share my experience of transformation. You'll understand what you're actually refusing." Before I could respond, her consciousness pressed into mine. There was no other way to describe it. Her thoughts, her memories, her sensory experience flowed into my awareness like water filling a container. I experienced her transformation from her perspective, felt what she had felt as orc surgeons modified her body, as chemicals rewrote her neurological responses, as her sense of self expanded to encompass alterations that should have been traumatic but registered as inevitable. The pain was significant, but manageable. The orcs had developed techniques that balanced modification with consciousness preservation, keeping subjects aware enough to maintain identity, while preventing suffering from overwhelming that identity. She had remained herself throughout, her memories intact, her capacity for thought undiminished. What changed was her relationship to her body, which became more tool than prison, and her relationship to the orcs, which became more partnership than subjugation. Transformed prisoners weren't slaves. They were collaborators, integrated into orc society at a level that granted status and purpose. They worked on projects that interested them, pursued questions that emerged from their hybrid perspectives, contributed to orc understanding of both human and greenskin biology. The entertainment value they had provided as prisoners continued, but evolved, their transformed nature itself becoming a source of fascination that the orcs documented and studied. It wasn't freedom, but it was life with structure and meaning, which was more than the pit offered, more than the Imperium had provided. The woman withdrew her consciousness from mine. I lay gasping on the table, my mind reeling from the forced intimacy, from the undeniable reality of what she had shown me. The transformation wasn't horror. It was simply different, a reconfiguration of existence that sacrificed one form of humanity for another form of agency. "You see?" she said. "It's not what you fear. It's just different. And different is better than broken." "Different is still loss," I said, though my conviction was weaker now. Even if the loss is acceptable, even if what replaces it has value, it's still giving up something that can't be recovered. "Everything is lost eventually," she replied. "Bodies age, minds deteriorate. The Imperium grinds people into meat for its endless wars. At least transformation offers the possibility of continuation with purpose. At least you'd be choosing evolution over dissolution." The lead orc had been waiting patiently during this exchange, its tools still ready. Now it moved forward again, clearly intent on proceeding whether I agreed or not. The woman stepped back, her intervention complete. She had shown me what transformation offered. The choice, such as it was, remained mine only in the sense that my mental state during the process would be influenced by my attitude toward it. The orc positioned tools around my body, preparing multiple modification points simultaneously. Other orcs moved into position, their roles apparently predetermined through long practice. This was a routine procedure, performed many times on many prisoners. My individual resistance or acceptance was noted, but ultimately irrelevant to the outcome. "Final question," I said, buying time I couldn't use productively, but needed psychologically. "Why do you transform us instead of just modifying yourselves? You clearly understand human physiology. Why not apply those insights to orc enhancement?" The lead orc paused again, this time apparently considering the question seriously. "Orc biology is fixed, strong, efficient, optimal for orc purposes. Human biology is flexible, weak baseline, but adaptable. Interesting to modify. Interesting to observe modification results. Also," it made a sound that might have been humor, "you are abundant. Many humans to experiment with. Only so many orcs. Waste reduction." The answer was pragmatic and horrifying in equal measure. Humans were experimental subjects because there were enough of us that losses didn't matter. The Imperium taught that human life was precious in the Emperor's eyes. The orcs taught that human life was abundant raw material suitable for research purposes. "Begin," the lead orc commanded. The first modification point was my throat, where chemical damage had left scarring. An orc brought a device that resembled both a medical scanner and a weapon, pressed it against my neck, and activated it. The sensation was beyond pain, a fundamental wrongness that bypassed normal sensory processing and registered directly as violation. My body convulsed against the restraints, but they held firm, preventing any motion that might disrupt the procedure. The device withdrew after perhaps 10 seconds that felt like hours. The damaged tissue in my throat had been removed, not healed, but excised. In its place, the orc inserted something synthetic, a replacement structure that integrated with my remaining biological tissue through methods I couldn't perceive, could feel happening. The sensation of foreign material merging with my body was deeply disturbing, wrong on levels that went beyond physical discomfort into existential crisis. The second modification point was my left shoulder, where previous selection damage had reduced mobility. The orc method here was surgical, cutting through skin and muscle with precision that suggested detailed knowledge of human anatomy. The damaged joint was removed entirely and replaced with something that combined organic and mechanical elements. I felt the new joint activate, felt it responding to neurological commands that I hadn't consciously sent, felt it becoming part of my proprioceptive map, despite its alien origin. The third modification point was internal, something injected into my bloodstream that spread rapidly through my system. The chemical agent was similar to what I had been forced to ingest during that early selection, but refined, modified to induce specific responses rather than general trauma. My metabolism accelerated, my sensory acuity increased, my pain threshold adjusted upward, not eliminating suffering, but making it more manageable, more something to be noted rather than something that overwhelmed cognition. The modifications continued. Some were physical, replacing or enhancing existing structures. Some were neurological, adjusting response patterns and cognitive processing. Some were purely chemical, altering how my body regulated itself and responded to stress. Each modification was individually manageable, but the cumulative effect was profound. I was being systematically disassembled and rebuilt according to specifications designed by beings who understood human biology better than most humans did. The woman watched throughout, her expression unreadable. She had undergone this same process, had experienced these same violations and transformations. Whatever she had become on the other side of the procedure, she appeared functional and conscious. That should have been reassuring. Instead, it emphasized how profoundly transformation altered what it meant to be those things. The procedures lasted hours. Time lost coherence as different modifications induced different states of consciousness, some heightened and analytical, some diminished and distant. The orcs worked with remarkable efficiency, their movements coordinated and purposeful. They consulted the data slate frequently, checking my body's responses against expected parameters, making adjustments when readings fell outside acceptable ranges. At some point during the process, I stopped resisting. Not because I accepted what was happening, but because resistance required a coherent self to organize opposition, and myself was being distributed across modified systems that didn't communicate through the neural architecture that had previously defined my identity. I existed in fragments, each aware of different aspects of the transformation, none capable of integrating those aspects into unified experience. This, I slowly realized, was the actual transformation. Not the physical modifications, which were extensive, but ultimately superficial. The real change was in how consciousness related to the body it inhabited, how identity formed when the substrate supporting it had been fundamentally altered. I was becoming something that could maintain continuity with Guardsman Kelth, while being functionally and psychologically different from him. The lead orc eventually stepped back, its tools set aside. It reviewed the data slate one final time, made a final notation, then nodded with apparent satisfaction. The other orcs began disconnecting equipment, removing instruments, cleaning the workspace. The procedure was complete. The restraints released. I sat up slowly, my body responding with efficiency that felt unnatural. The modifications were already integrated, or body functioning as if they had always been part of me. I looked down at my hands and saw that the skin had taken on that same greenish undertone the woman displayed, subtle but unmistakable. I touched my throat and felt the synthetic structure beneath the skin, felt it processing air with enhanced efficiency. I was changed, irreversibly, fundamentally changed. Not entirely orc, but no longer entirely human. Something between. Something new that combined elements of both while being neither. "How do you feel?" the woman asked. The question required consideration. I inventoried my physical state, noting reduced pain, enhanced mobility, altered sensory input. I examined my mental state, noting preserved memories, maintained reasoning capacity, shifted emotional responses. I assessed my sense of identity, noting continuity with Guardsman Kelth while acknowledging fundamental differences. "Different," I finally answered. "Still myself, but different." "That's the transformation," she said. "You continue, but what you continue as has been improved for survival in this context. The pit can't break you now, not the same way." She was right. The modifications had enhanced my capacity to endure the pit's challenges. Physically, I was more robust, more capable of recovering from damage. Neurologically, I was better equipped to manage stress without psychological collapse. Chemically, I was optimized for the malnutrition and toxin exposure that characterized pit existence. I had been made into a better prisoner, or, from the Ork perspective, a better research subject. The lead Ork approached and handed me clothing, plain fabric that would fit my modified body. I dressed, noting how the material moved differently across skin that was no longer quite human. The Ork then gestured toward the chamber's exit. "Return to pit," it commanded. "Observe how modifications improve selection survival. Document responses. Report results after 7 cycles." The instruction was clear. I had been transformed not to remove me from the pit, but to return me as an enhanced subject whose performance could be compared against baseline measurements. I was still entertainment, still research data, but now I was also proof of concept, demonstration that transformation could maintain consciousness while enhancing utility. The woman accompanied me back through the corridors toward the pit. We walked in silence, her presence offering no comfort but serving as reminder that I was not unique, that this transformation had been performed many times, that there was a population of transformed prisoners navigating existence in spaces between human and Ork. "What happens next?" I asked as we approached the pit entrance. "You continue," she replied. "You survive selections more efficiently. You demonstrate transformation success. You contribute to Ork understanding. Eventually, you might be selected for further transformation, deeper integration. Or you might remain at this level, useful but not essential. The Orks will decide based on your performance and their needs. And if I try to resist, if I use these enhancements to fight back, then you'll fail and die," she said, without emotion. "The modifications improve survival, not rebellion capacity. The Orks aren't stupid. They've accounted for possible resistance. The transformed prisoners who tried to fight were neutralized efficiently. Those who survived, like me, accepted reality and found ways to make peace with it." We reached the pit entrance. The familiar sounds and smells washed over me, but my modified sensory processing handled them differently, parsing information more efficiently, categorizing stimuli with less emotional reaction. I could see better in the low light, hear the Orks' conversations more clearly, detect chemical traces that had been imperceptible before. I stepped back into the pit, into the space that had defined my existence for weeks. I couldn't accurately count, but I entered it differently, no longer merely victim of its logic, but partially integrated into it. The other prisoners noticed immediately, their eyes tracking the changes in my appearance and bearing. Some reacted with fear, others with curiosity. Sorek approached slowly, studying me carefully. "They transformed you," he said. "Yes. How bad?" I considered the question. How did one measure the badness of losing humanity while gaining survival capacity? How did one weigh consciousness preservation against identity alteration? "Survivable," I finally answered. "It's survivable." He nodded, accepting the answer as sufficiently comprehensive. "Then you'll last longer than most, maybe long enough to understand what the Orks are actually building here." "What do you mean?" "The pit isn't about entertainment or research," Sorek said. "Those are components, but the actual purpose is larger. They're building something with us, something that requires both human and Ork elements. The transformed prisoners are prototypes. We're all prototypes. And when they perfect the design, when they figure out exactly how to integrate human and Ork biology into stable configurations, they'll scale up. Can you imagine what an army of transformed prisoners could accomplish? Human intelligence combined with Ork physical capability and resilience. The implication was staggering. The pit wasn't merely processing individuals. It was developing methodology that could be applied at massive scale, creating hybrid forces that combined the strengths of both species while minimizing weaknesses. The Imperium's greatest nightmare, given form through systematic experimentation on captured prisoners. "Why tell me this?" I asked. "Because you're transformed now," Sorek replied. "Because you're going to survive long enough that you'll need to understand what you're surviving for. And because maybe, eventually, you'll be positioned to do something about it. Or not. Either way, understanding is better than ignorance." He walked away, leaving me to process the information. Around me, the pit continued its routine operations. Orks above watched and called out. Prisoners below moved through their spaces, some preparing for selections, others recovering from them. The woman stood at the chamber's edge, observing but not intervening, her transformed nature marking her as separate from both populations. I found a clear space and sat, my modified body requiring less rest, but my mind needing time to integrate everything that had happened. The transformation was complete, but not finished. I would continue changing as my body adapted to the modifications, as my consciousness adjusted to operating through altered neurological structures. The person I had been was gone. The person I was becoming was still uncertain. Guardsman Vero Kelth had died in the pit, not through any single moment, but through accumulated degradation of everything that identity represented. What remained was something else, something that could look at the pit and see not just horror, but systematic logic, not just suffering, but data collection, not just imprisonment, but transformation process. The Orks wanted entertainment. They wanted research data. They wanted proof that human consciousness could be preserved through extreme modification. I was providing all three, and my enhanced survival capacity meant I would continue providing them far longer than unmodified prisoners could. This was my existence now. Not resistance or escape, not death or freedom, but continuation within a system designed to sustain itself through the transformation of everything it captured. The Imperium had failed to kill me in combat. The pit had failed to break me through suffering. What succeeded was something more insidious: integration. I looked up at the Orks watching from above and recognized something in their posture that I had misinterpreted throughout my time in the pit. They weren't simply cruel or sadistic. They were curious. Genuinely, profoundly curious about what humans could become under specific conditions. The entertainment they derived wasn't from suffering itself, but from the emergence of unexpected outcomes, from watching transformation occur, from documenting the process by which one form of life evolved into another. In that recognition was a terrible truth. The Orks and I now shared something fundamental. We were both interested in what I was becoming. My transformation had created alignment between my perspective and theirs. Not complete, but sufficient that I could understand their purposes even while remaining distinct from them. The woman was right. This was mercy compared to dissolution. But it was also damnation. Consciousness preserved through changes that meant the preserving entity was no longer quite the thing being preserved. I would survive. I would continue. But what survived and continued was increasingly uncertain, identity becoming negotiable under the pressure of modifications designed to optimize utility rather than preserve essence. Somewhere in the Imperium, there were still soldiers who believed in the God Emperor's protection, who fought with certainty that their deaths would have meaning. Somewhere, There were citizens who never questioned the systems that governed their lives, who accepted their roles without the kind of deep examination that the pit forced on everyone it touched. I envied those people not for their delusions, but for their capacity to maintain them, for existing in contexts where transformation was optional rather than inevitable. In the pit, nothing was optional. Everything that could be changed would be changed, bodies and minds both, until the original configuration was barely recognizable beneath layers of modification and adaptation. Some prisoners broke under this pressure. Some transformed and found new equilibrium. I was doing both simultaneously, breaking and transforming in the same sustained moment that stretched across time without resolution. The orcs above began organizing for another selection. Their movements suggested combat entertainment, multiple prisoners to be deployed against some designated threat. I watched the preparation with my enhanced perception and felt nothing like the fear that would have consumed Guardsman Kelth. Instead, I felt calculation, assessment of probabilities, analysis of how my modifications might improve performance if I were selected. I was becoming what the pit had been designed to create, a consciousness that could maintain itself through transformation, that could survive not despite change, but through embracing it, that could look at horror and see only data worth processing. The orcs had succeeded in creating exactly what they wanted. And the worst part was understanding that success, seeing the logic behind it, recognizing the effectiveness of their methods. When the selecting orc descended and pointed at me, I stood without hesitation. My modified body responded with efficiency that would have been impossible before transformation. I walked toward the combat zone with steady steps, my mind already cataloging the arena's features, identifying optimal positions, calculating survival strategies with cold precision that belonged neither to Guardsman Kelth nor to anything fully human. The orcs above watched with that sustained attention I now understood as professional interest. They were documenting my performance, comparing it to baseline measurements from before transformation, gathering data that would inform future modifications on future prisoners. I was contributing to their research through my mere existence, through every choice and action, through the simple fact of continuing to function despite everything that had been done to enable that function. The combat itself was brutal and efficient. My enhanced capabilities translated directly into improved survival probability. I moved faster, struck harder, recovered from injuries more quickly than unmodified prisoners could. The threat we faced, some kind of modified Gretchen swarm, fell before sustained aggression that my previous self would have been incapable of maintaining. The other prisoners selected for this combat followed my lead, their survival instincts recognizing enhanced capability and organizing around it. When the combat concluded, I stood among the survivors, my body marked by new injuries that were already beginning to heal through modifications I barely understood. The orcs above responded with the usual enthusiasm, their vocalizations suggesting satisfaction with the entertainment provided. The selecting orc descended to inspect survivors, paying particular attention to me, documenting my condition and performance for whatever analysis would follow. I was marked again, another symbol added to the collection accumulating on my forehead. Each mark represented survival, adaptation, transformation. Each mark was evidence that the pit system worked exactly as designed, converting prisoners into research subjects who generated valuable data through their continued existence. That night, in the darkness between selections, I tried one final time to locate Guardsman Vero Kelth within the modified consciousness I had become. I searched my memories for the person who had responded to Imperial authority without question, who had believed in duty and honor and the Emperor's protection. I found memories intact, experiences preserved, but the emotional connection to that identity was attenuated, stretched thin across transformations that had recontextualized everything those memories meant. Guardsman Kelth existed as historical figure, someone I remembered being, but no longer was. The transformation had created continuity, but not identity. I could access his memories, understand his motivations, even respect his certainty. But I could no longer be him, could no longer inhabit that framework without recognizing its limitations and contradictions. This was the pit's final lesson, that identity itself was conditional, that consciousness could persist through radical alteration, that the human insistence on stable selfhood was itself a kind of prison that limited adaptation and survival. The orcs understood this intuitively. Their entire culture built on transformation and evolution. They had simply applied that understanding to human prisoners, systematically demonstrating that we too could be transformed without being destroyed. I survived the pit not through resistance, but through becoming something that resistance could no longer protect, something that had integrated enough orc logic to function within their systems, while maintaining enough human consciousness to recognize what had been lost in the process. The Imperium would call me traitor or heretic. Labels that presumed loyalty and faith were absolute rather than contingent. The orcs called me successful experiment, label that recognized transformation without judgment. Neither label captured the truth of what I had become. Consciousness caught between categories, identity distributed across modifications that made unity impossible, existence reduced to the simple imperative to continue even when continuation meant abandoning everything that had previously defined worth and meaning. The pit did not break me. It rebuilt me, and in rebuilding created something that could look back at Guardsman Vero Kelth with understanding and regret and recognition that his death, gradual and complete, was necessary for my survival. The person recounting this is not the person who entered the pit, but there is continuity, thin and strained but present, connecting the before and after through modifications designed to preserve consciousness, even as they altered everything that consciousness meant. This is what happens when you're thrown into an Ork Flesh Pit. You don't simply die or survive. You transform, incrementally and inevitably, until the question of survival becomes meaningless, because the entity surviving is no longer quite the entity that entered. The orcs understand this. They built the pit to document it. And I, having lived through that documentation, can only report what they systematically proved: that human identity is far more flexible than the Imperium admits, that consciousness can persist through changes that should be fatal to selfhood, and that survival itself is neutral, neither victory nor defeat, but simply continuation of a transformed existence that remembers being something else.